as well, how COVID-19 affected Hollywood and what are the ramifications, aftermath, and so forth. And I thought he'd be reasonably expert in commenting on that. So Wade, tell us a little bit about yourself, your thoughts, and what's been up.
Longtime film critic and writer, known primarily as a film critic. I can be, those unfortunate enough to be in Southern California can hear me once or twice a month on KPCC. I'm one of the partners in cinegods.com. I do the digigods.com podcast every couple of weeks with my colleague Tim Cogshell. And I'm also a member of the LA Film Critics Association and the Critics' Choice awards. So those are my bona fides. The pandemic had an unprecedented impact on the entertainment industry, primarily on theatrical film distribution, for the obvious reason that when we shut down, when we locked down, the theaters close. And for the major studios, that's their lifeblood. That's where movies are, that's where their value is calibrated. And whatever value a film has in the theatrical distribution arena, that value then is projected into all the ancillary streams, into streaming, into planes and VOD and DVDs and Blu-rays and 4Ks and all of that. So it's all downstream from theatrical. If you pull theatrical off the top, suddenly these companies are crippled. The one that's not necessarily is Netflix, because Netflix is not premised on a theatrical model. Theirs is the streaming model. So suddenly everybody's at home. Netflix was able to benefit to a significant degree. But then the added problem was on the production end. Now we have to be testing. And all the guilds and the unions had to come together and agree with all of the producers on a protocol that respected public health concerns, that respected their concerns as guilds and unions and representatives of their various their people. Mm-hmm. And they introduced an extremely rigid testing regime, testing every day, which now is down to once a week, thank goodness. But the routine testing on films like the last Jurassic World film added an enormous amount of cost. And it adds time. It adds staff. You have to hire a company. And these people made a killing, these companies that popped up that were doing testing people on a daily basis on production. But then you have all of these additional issues. For example, Warner Brothers. The backlot at Warner Brothers for the last 2 years has not been available for shooting. You have not been able to shoot exteriors on the Warner lot because all the testing facilities took up the outdoor spaces. Right? So these are additional things. So now you're losing money on that end as well. It's taking away another opportunity to make money because you're using the soundstage. So where are you going to put the testing facilities? In these giant tents outdoors. And in addition, all of your dining facilities now have to be outdoors and distanced. And then there's the added handicap of zones. They created production zones to minimize interaction between various departments on a set. Normally, the director talks to the actors, the director talks to the electricians, everyone. There's a regular, very collegial interface between all the departments to make it work. With zones, suddenly there's zone one, which is director and the actors. And no one in that zone can interface with people in another zone who can't interface with people in another zone. So you've created these little kind of virtual quarantine, these virtual micro quarantine groups. And again, that adds cost, it adds time, it adds logistics, and it has a deleterious impact on the creative process, which requires people to feel as free and open as possible, to experiment as much as possible. And the more rules you impose on them, the less creative they're going to be. So at every level now, you're making production harder, you're making it more expensive, you're taking away the logistical opportunity to be as creative as possible. You're taking away production space that would otherwise be available for rental. And then you're reducing the opportunities for films to be released into the marketplace. And finally, people are locked up at home. They're not going to movie theaters. And even if movie theaters are open, they're still reticent, even right now. So at every level, this just cripples a workflow, a business, a workflow that fuels the business that for the last, 80, 90 years has been taken for granted. This is how movies work. We may introduce a bit of new technology here and there, VHS, DVD, streaming, to sort of add to the bottom line. But for the most part, you're making films, you're releasing films, audiences are seeing films. And now every piece of that equation is disrupted at once. So that has had a terrible, terrible impact. I'll give you one, and I'll throw this back to you after this. I'll give you one example. A friend of mine wrote a short film. A short film, you would think, well, surely it's going to impact big films more than short films. We understand a big film, the more extras you have, the more people are on set. That's more testing. That's more time spent testing. That's where the money really adds. You can add $10-20 million to a big blockbuster, but a short film, no. Well, they were going to shoot this little short film at a casino just outside of Las Vegas, until they were told, yeah, everyone has to actually be quarantined in the hotel for 10 days and tested before you begin shooting. They said, but we have day players, we have extras. They said, no, that's how it is. And suddenly this short film, where the budgets are very marginal, that added, I think, 25% to the budget, made it prohibitively expensive. You can't add 25% to a short film budget. It's just, so they pulled the plug, and they were able to shoot it about a year later on a riverboat somewhere in near the Mississippi Delta. But that was a year delayed. It cast changes. That impacts people's career choices, and it impacts people's availability to work. So all of these things have been just enormously disruptive. It has really, really damaged both the high end and the low end. It's hurt high end films. The Batman, for example, is one that survived this. The Batman, which was directed by a friend of mine, Matt Reeves, was shut down twice for COVID. Shut down first when the pandemic broke out, then they started up again, and then Patterson, who plays Batman, came down with COVID, and they had to shut down again. So that film took over a year in production. It made its money back. It was very successful. They managed to prevail, but the cost was enormous. And I think the COVID impact on Tom Cruise's next Mission Impossible, there was a piece, I want to say it was in the Atlantic, talking about how COVID impacted that film. And it's added something like $30 million to the film, just in logistics, in location changes, in schedule changes. So really, really expensive films became a lot more expensive. And very inexpensive films became unmakeable because they're operating on much, much thinner margins. So it's been incredibly disruptive. The analysts all feel like 2023 is our slowly creep back to normal year, but that we won't see a real inventory of movies to fill theaters and a real willingness of people to fill seats in those theaters probably until about 12 months from now. And, knock on wood, all things kind of going without a further hitch, 2024, in theory, should be our 100% back to normal year.
So we have the mild silver lining in this huge cloud of having a little bit of federalism. States can do different things. Was it a state by state thing? Did intrepid movie producers, I don't know, try Louisiana or Florida, Texas? Were there films migrating?
That has been happening even without COVID for quite some time. California is a little schizophrenic that way. Actually, a lot schizophrenic. California is the movie business is sort of the last business. It hasn't chased.
I think schizophrenic is one of those binary things. It's probably just schizophrenic.
The movie business is sort of one of the last. That and wine and tech are the last businesses that California hasn't been able to chase away. But even though the movie business is still localized here in Los Angeles County, much of the production goes away, and it has for the last 20 years slowly been fleeing to states that have been offering much better incentives, notably Georgia, which has benefited tremendously, and New Mexico has gotten a lot, Arizona has gotten some, Louisiana has gotten a lot. So a lot of production has fled to other states, and I think Georgia being the primary beneficiary of that.
But it wouldn't happen for something like the Batman, though, which I assume has a lot of studio needs.
That's shot in London. Yeah,
Oh, I
that's shot
see.
in London, and that's
Oh,
and those facilities are always filled. I mean, London is a wonderful place to shoot for a lot of reasons. A lot of people prefer to go there, the quality of the crews and other things. The impact of COVID on local production fleeing, I don't know that it was that huge because the guilds came to an agreement on testing and zones, which was not local to here. That was for all union productions.
hmm.
So, if you were doing a non-union production, then you could basically do whatever you wanted as long as your
Hmm.
cast and crew were in agreement. But there were a lot of people who just weren't willing to work under those circumstances. It was a risk to them. So, for the union stuff, whether it was in Georgia, whether it's in California, whether New Mexico, or even overseas, they were all required to adhere to the same protocols.
Did it change the type of movies? Well, let me just backtrack a little bit because you were mentioning Netflix, and this is an interesting dichotomy, and I'd like to hear more of your thought process, which I read recently as well. So they had a different model, and we can talk a little bit about that. But they had a need for content. Did they have the same restraints, constraints, or were they working on backlogged inventory, or undercover movies from Belgium or something like that?
No, Netflix is always. I mean, it's an enormous operation that has a voracious appetite for content. Netflix's philosophy is more content equals more subscribers. I think that's been challenged as they face more competition in the marketplace. But anything that they were making on their own, they had to adhere to the same protocols as everyone else. Now Netflix throws money at things, so they were able to simply they don't operate on the same model of each film has its own profit and loss statement. So we need this film to make money. We need the next film to make money. They just spend a large pot on a large a large pot of money on a large pot of product, and that's supposed to translate into subscribers. So they can afford to be a little bit more fungible with the way they spend their money on testing and all of that.
Hmm.
They were a lot less concerned with the
Oh,
individual budgets of the film.
oh,
At
I
the
see.
same
That's an interesting point.
Yeah, at the same time, it was pretty rigid. A close friend of mine was part of the cast on the last season of Stranger Things, and there was a lot of testing. And he was testing going, and he was testing coming. And he flew back to LA for the holidays last year, and then flew back because he had to get tested to fly
And
back
it
in.
must must
It was
it must be
nonstop.
very difficult to, like, I mean, let's say we're running a military troop, and or a basketball team, and every 5 minutes, three of the players are down.
Yeah.
I mean, how do they if somebody turns positive and she's the co-star, um, you know, I don't know. I assume they figure out ways to film around or something like that. I have no idea.
The productions shut down. A lot of productions shut down. We have a close friend. She was producing a film that someone tested positive. I think they had to shut down for 5-10 days. That's money. That's an insurance claim.
Was was
Yeah.
there any kind of pushback? I mean, some of these things would be admissions against interest, or admissions against political interest. Sometimes might be admission for financial interest, but the finances and the politics might kind of um, go at odd angles.
There has been pushback. There was an organization formed, Hollywood Against Mandates, HAM, nice acronym, which slowly gaining traction. At the corporate level, there hasn't been a lot of pushback because they don't want to run afoul of public health officials and
Yeah, they
and
don't
some
want
of
to
the other.
stick their necks out.
They definitely don't. Where the guilds are concerned, they always err on the side of the most concerned of their members,
Hmm.
and the dissenters have been a minority throughout. People want to be, everyone knows how what the interaction is on a set, and people were, for the first part of the pandemic, were legitimately afraid. They were
Hmm.
seeing the death counts, and they thought, I don't want to get sick on a film, but I got to work. So whatever you can do to make my work safer, let's do it.
Hmm.
And I think now, recently, the people that we've been talking to, they are finally starting to get fed up. And enough already with the masks. I can do hair and makeup without wearing a mask. I'd rather not now. I'm kind of done with that.
Mm.
I know a lot of people who've gotten COVID. They didn't get that sick. Or maybe they got COVID and it wasn't as bad as they thought. And so a lot of things are happening There's fatigue on the one side, pandemic fatigue coupled with it's probably not as bad as it used to be or as people said it was. So all of these factors are kind of working to get people to accept a more endemic reality where the pandemic is concerned. And the fact that now they're only testing once a week, not spending as much on it. Production is starting to slowly ramp back up again. Theaters are not doing as great as everyone had hoped. But you have things like Avatar out there that are doing big business. People are going to the movie theaters, so it all works in kind of a snowball fashion, and eventually we'll get back.
So isn't Avatar animated?
Well, that's the question. It is a mostly computer generated film. So, in theory, you could argue that it is an animated film, but it's motion capture, and there's a lot of
Okay.
argument as to whether that's animated or not.
Right. So they still need the actors around
Correct.
to do the stuff with all these
Yes, that's right.
tracking devices on them and all that
Mhm.
kind of stuff. So they probably had some of the similar constraints. Was there kind of a change? Did animation as a category get a little more active because you don't need to
Definitely.
keep Bart Simpson in a mask?
Definitely. If you're working in any of the fields where you don't have to be in an office, you don't have to be on a set where you can sit at home in front of a computer or a workstation and be just as productive. Yes, all of those parts of the business have managed to weather it pretty well. There's a trickle down effect where if the films that you would normally be working on, if there are fewer of those, then the work is reduced. But otherwise, people in the visual effects field, people in animation were able to continue working at more or less the same clip that they did previously.
So when you mentioned that so we'll keep the bimodal aspect. We're talking about, say, classic Hollywood versus Netflix, and under the rubric of classic Hollywood will include the major production studios and so forth and their business model. With theaters closed, why would they bother making movies at all? I mean, what's the concept there? Should they have just taken a sabbatical? I mean, what happened with the movies that did get produced? Did they, reach people? Or are they in storage waiting to come out now? I just don't know enough.
A lot of the stuff was pushed, the because no one knew how long this would last, how severe it would be. There was this game of release dates that just kept getting pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed. Top Gun Maverick was supposed to be released at the end of 20, what was it? It was like mid 2020 or late 2020, I think,
Hmm.
originally. So, more than, I mean, just about 2 years delayed that film. So, Tom Cruise is 2 years younger in that film than everyone thinks that
But
he
he
is.
looks 2 years younger every
Yeah,
year.
that's true. That's true. And, Mission Impossible, likewise. All these films, Batman, we talked about, all these films kind of saw their release dates, shuffled and shuffled and shuffled. And the more expensive the film, the more important the release date, because you want to sort of own your release date and the radius of weeks around it so that you have
Mhm.
a moment to really capture the news cycle, capture audiences, and there are all of these metrics that if you make an X amount of money, the next weekend drops off a certain percentage, another percentage. So you have actuaries who will calculate, well, we need, if we get such and such an opening, we'll be able to count on so much money. They know how much they can make. So the
Right.
weekend is very, very important. And if you can't get your coveted, Memorial Day weekend, well, then you've got to push it to July 4th. And if you can't get July 4th, well, now you're pushing it into the holiday season. You can't just push it 2 or 3 weeks. You
Mhm.
have to find an optimal week where the competition is not there and where you can really exploit people being out, people not being in school or not working or whatever.
Mhm.
So all of these things made it very, very hard for these movies keep slipping release dates. Some will slip to a date, and then another movie can't get that date, and then they get another date, and another movie can't get that date. So, and then the question is, will there be people to go to the theaters? And to answer your question, you have to keep making movies and releasing movies because you have debt, you have all of the overhead of these studios. You can't just have thousands of people working for Warner Brothers or Disney sitting there doing nothing. You're spending money on these paychecks. Something has to bring money in to offset your overhead.
So did that lead to any difference in acuity of focus, or I guess was there a sharper eye to figuring out which movies might not be essential to the bottom line. I think there's so I'm begging the question here in a sense. The question I'm begging is, Hollywood has a kind of a political motive for seemingly for a lot of films, and then there's just the way the car companies make their money on pickup trucks, say, and then they produce a lot of other things. It would seem that there probably are movies that are more nearly guaranteed, nothing is, but to make money, and others are there to promote a concept, to get, to move the narrative. Was there any shifting of that? Have you seen that, or are they being a little more spare and circumspect about the type of movies they might go to get money makers as opposed to, say, political loss leaders?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I have to say I haven't noticed. I haven't noticed an overt impact, anything that appears to be deliberate or intentional. There are certainly a handful of films that were made to comment on the pandemic. They were made under pandemic circumstances, like kind of found footage or first person, some
The
movies that took
Blair,
place.
the Blair Witch.
Yeah, there was this dreadful Anthony Hopkins film that it was like the whole film took place on Zoom. It was just a screen with people interacting with others. It tried to be a thriller, and people are seeing, people getting attacked by Zoom. Right? It was, there was some ingenuity that went into this. There were a few films made about people who were quarantined together, so they had to be in one location. They couldn't leave.
Yeah, he's a pretty famous director, isn't he?
Which one?
Quarantino.
Yeah. That's a good one.
Yeah, actually,
No one's done that yet.
yeah, I don't think I just thought of it this second because we're on movies, but I had been thinking previously that quarantine is an Italian term. It's the quarente,
Right.
is the 40 days. We're lucky to get off with 10. Actually, we
Yeah.
weren't lucky. I mean, given that the science has improved, I think this is, Renaissance era, whatever, I don't know, Black Death or something like that. It could have been earlier, but they came up with 40 days, so they call it the quarante, and it became the quarantino, quarantine, whatever. And it is kind of interesting that if you take the Quentin and the Tarantino, you pretty much have the quarantino. But speaking of which, I mean, well, actually, to leave that kind of topic aside, actors, um, they don't necessarily have the constraints that the production houses do, and they tend to be a little bit more loose. Um, they're a little bit more creative types theoretically. And did any of them speak out? And I don't, I try not to put a lot of faith in the knowledge base of actors as a whole, but some of them have reasonable intelligence and work around things. I mean, I think they're all reasonably intelligent. I don't want to say that, but I think some of them are not necessarily book learning types or resourceful researchers for events aside from what they might have heard. Anyway, so with that long preface, did any actors speak out against kind of the unfairness, or this is too much, or we don't need all this, or anything like that?
Yes, there was pushback, not as much as I had expected. I think a lot of the pushback has been private, not public. In talking to agents, talking to producers, talking to studios, I think it has been much more internal and compartmentalized. But there were actors who came out and said, I'm against this vaccine mandate, and I'm not going to get vaccinated. It's experimental. I don't know enough about it. And mostly, I think, on daytime soaps, and some of them were longstanding cast members, and they were fired. And I think there are perhaps some legal repercussions to that haven't quite
I think
worked.
they could just be killed by the script.
Yeah, it's very easy to do in daytime television, but it was very public. These were actors that said, my career is not worth my principles, and they get lost in their jobs.
And they're probably right. I mean, I know there are actors of all ages, but I think it skews younger than the average population, because we want to see idealized people. Did anyone write any scripts that that acted that way? I mean, that
I have seen a few movies that make mention of the pandemic, that take it into account. I think it's going to be a very interesting thing, because in not too many years, this is going to be a distant memory. And films that were made deliberately to under pandemic circumstances to incorporate that into the story are going to be either unwatchable. Most of them are already unwatchable, or it's going to be something we don't want to relive. No one wants to
Hmm.
go back and remember that moment.
Hmm.
It's there's no great nostalgia to that. It's
Hmm.
hard enough to create nostalgic movies about wartime. No one's going to want to make nostalgia about a pandemic.
Hmm.
So I think those are going to suffer. I think that there are maybe a handful of films that are perhaps in production right now that are taking it into account. I don't see those as having a long lifespan. They may not even wind up getting made. Um, I think there is definitely a backlog. There are scripts that are written. There are films that have been ready to go. They just haven't had the economic pathway that made any sense. And it's also worth remembering too that two giant mergers happened during the pandemic that also created a lot of disarray, which is that Amazon purchased MGM
Hmm.
and Discovery merged with Warner Brothers. And both of those entered daunting debt situations, particularly Discovery taking Warner Brothers over from AT&T. There are billions of dollars in debt that have to be dealt with there. So they've been slashing shows and slashing jobs, and really, really taking a hatchet to the whole operation, in addition to everything that the pandemic did. So there are all of these other mitigating factors that happened during the pandemic that have magnified the impacts.
So what was Amazon's intent? I mean, do they want to run it? I assume they want to run up against Netflix. Um, they're trying to change the studios into Netflix-like.
I mean, Amazon is an interesting company, and I think a lot of us are still a little bit curious as to where they're going to position themselves. Amazon makes enough money off of its online operation to buy and sell all the rest of Hollywood twice over every year.
Hmm.
There's a huge amount of money there, which is beyond anything that Netflix can dream of. More than Warner Brothers. You're talking about parent companies too. That doesn't factor that in. And yet their engagement has been very conservative. They started off making mostly independent movies. Then they went more to television. They did do a huge spend, putting out an outlay of $1 billion for the Lord of the Rings series. But then again, Netflix spends billions on a regular basis on all kinds of stuff. They don't spend $1 billion on a single show, but they come, there. It means Stranger Things is an expensive show, and a lot of their other shows are costly too. So Amazon has been slowly dipping its toes into production. They don't have the greatest streaming platform. I think they could if they wanted to. And buying MGM was buying now a legacy brand, which they didn't have before. And they bought a studio over here. They bought the old Selznick Studios, known as the Culver Studios now. They've been expanding that, so they now have a studio lot. And it looks to me like Amazon's long-term plan is to become more of a traditional legacy studio and theatrical distribution enterprise, and to turn streaming into something that backstops that, which is more the HBO Max and the Disney Plus model than the Netflix model.
Hmm.
So we'll see. Over time, that'll take shape, but it's a very slow process. They are moving very deliberately.
Now, there's been a certain amount of American quasi-colonial influence around the world via Hollywood. Is that something that persists? It's a very broad question because I mean, obviously, other countries went through various stages of in my view, overreaction to a bad flu. Um, does Hollywood, does it? I suppose there's two questions. One is in the immediate. One is kind of in a broader philosophic sense. Whether Hollywood still has the cachet, the reach, and the draw, and whether there are other countries on its tails. Obviously, the kind of the elephant or the tiger in the room is China. Whether they still have an interest in other countries, whether they want some of the messages that are coming from Hollywood? So that's a enormous question. So I figured to give it a 2-word answer.
No, it's a good one. Hollywood's reach has always been strong, and it will continue to be. It didn't really become the Hollywood. There was parity in the silent days between Germany and the United States, and Hollywood and Italy and France. Everyone had their silent industries. Japan had a great silent industry. And it wasn't really until the aftermath of World War One, which just destroyed every other economy, that Hollywood emerged. And during the 1920s, when sound came in, by the 1930s, now Hollywood pretty much runs the world. And it did that not just with its homegrown talent, but it did it by bringing talent from overseas to Hollywood. So if there was someone in Germany, directors like Fritz Lang or Ernst Lubitsch, bring them to Hollywood. Bring Billy Wilder to Hollywood. Anybody who was doing great work in France, bring them to Hollywood. Just about everybody wound up coming to Hollywood at some point and making films. And Jean Renoir came to Hollywood and made movies. I mean, it's so Hollywood has been able to dominate by usurping and kind of hijacking talent from those other industries as well, and it still does that. You look at how many foreign directors work in Hollywood. It's extraordinary. They all come here because they want those Hollywood careers. So the myth perpetuates the business in many respects, and it continues to be a valued. Hollywood is the big dog in whether it's France, Germany, Japan, wherever it is. China is interesting because it's an autocratic state. They control everything, and they are very suspicious of Western ideas and values and anything that might come in. So China has never been an open market for Hollywood. It started a few decades ago with, okay, we're going to handpick, 5, 6, 10 films that we will allow to come into China, but whatever they earn has to stay in China. Well, so the studios see this as an opportunity. They think that this is going to eventually go away. And what they wind up doing is the studios all invested in this massive theater building operation throughout China, because they wanted to create the seats so that they could put their movies in front of all those people. There weren't enough screens, so Hollywood didn't just bring their movies into China. They came in with money to build the movie theaters that they would put their movies into. And some of us, I'm sorry to say, I hate being in an I told you so position, looked at this and said, you know what China's going to do? They're using you to build infrastructure.
Well, they did the same thing with the automobile industry, did they not?
Absolutely. And at a certain point, once you've built all these theaters, they're just going to kiss all the Hollywood movies goodbye, and they're going to make Chinese movies and put them into the theaters that you wound up building. And that's exactly what's happening now. Now, part of that is Hollywood's fault. Disney has had something like 5 or 6 Marvel films now rejected from release in China because they've keep loading it up with cultural content that the censors in China say not going to happen, and they know that ahead of time. So it looks like the studios are beginning to grow a little bit fatigued of kissing up to the Chinese and having to change films. You've had, everything from I think with Top Gun Maverick, there was an issue with the fact that the Taiwanese flag was once displayed on his jacket in a patch, right? One of the Iron Man films had to change some of the advertising in it to accommodate Chinese audiences. There are all of these things that have been really a nuisance in dealing with Chinese censors and autocrats. If you just write the Chinese audience off, if you just write China off as a market and focus on the rest of the world the way you used to, it's much easier. It's sort of like having 10 children and that one spoiled child takes all of your attention because they're so demanding. And it's just not worth it at a certain point. So I almost feel like let the Chinese continue to make their, horrible blockbusters for the Chinese market. And it'll wind up being a little bit like the Indian market. Hollywood penetrates the Indian market a little bit, but for the most part, India has 3 very large film industries, and each of them make a lot of movies in those 3 large local languages. And that's primarily what fills theaters in India. And that's great. It's a homegrown industry for a homegrown audience, and China can be that too. And Hollywood can still rule the rest of the world.
And so the rest of the world is Europe, the kind of the Anglophone countries? I mean, does it
Yeah.
include Africa, Latin America?
It includes Africa. It includes the Middle East. It includes Latin America, definitely. The Pacific Rim, significantly. Japan is a very large market, even though they have a tremendous homegrown market. Korea, likewise, great homegrown market, but also a great appetite for Hollywood movies. Australia, not a huge country, but a great market for American films, and has also been a great talent pool for a lot of talent that has come to Hollywood. I mean, we forget, Kate Blanchett and Hugh Jackman and directors like Peter Weir, on and on and on. I mean, there are Australians
Nicole
all over
Kidman?
Hollywood. Nicole Kidman, so there's no shortage of Australians in Hollywood.
Is that Margot Robbie too? Is she?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Probably make a decent movie right there.
Yeah.
Hmm. And I assume the turn down in movie volume happened everywhere else. I mean, is it happening still in China? I mean, they've got this COVID zero.
Yeah.
I don't. I think now it's COVID, 0.1. I think
Yeah.
it's a little bit, a number slightly greater than zero, but uh, less
The, the
than.
the Chinese movie industry has been very, very badly hurt by their incredibly intemperate COVID policies. And it's hard for us to know exactly how hurt, because the data that China allows to the rest of the world makes no sense. I think we all remember when we were all sort of trying to trust Chinese numbers. Oh, they only had 15,000 deaths. Oh, great. It's not that deadly. I mean, and now the estimates over how many really died in China are through the roof. But we don't know, because it's not corroborated, because it's not a autocratic state.
Hmm.
So
Yeah. So just to kind of keep on the China theme slightly, um, I- is that likely to affect content aside from Taiwanese flags and the like? Is it likely to affect kind of the, say, more moral um, items and issues, some that are on our brave new world horizon? Um, the proliferation of gender identities and whatnot. I don't think China really is quite yet on board with that
no. And
promotional and so forth. Do they exclude other movies, or do they have a way of doing it? Is there a demand abroad for those things? Do those fly outside? I can't think of the titles. Perhaps you can. I know that like it was Moonlight or something like that. Wasn't quite on
yeah,
that topic, but won the Academy Award. Did that movie? That's pre-pandemic, I believe. Did that movie fly anywhere else?
Moonlight has a very good reputation all over the world. It's a highly regarded film, just as a work of art. But Moonlight was also made for $1 million. So Moonlight has become enormously profitable many, many times over, because it was so inexpensive to make. Uh, Films of that nature, they play across Latin America, they play across Europe, they play a little bit in Africa and then the Pacific Rim. But when you start getting into themes that deal with gender roles, with religion, those are touchier topics that will lose you the Chinese market instantly. They will lose you the Russian market instantly, and they will lose you all of the Middle East. Middle Eastern nations are very, very. It'll also lose you large markets in Asia too. Um, you have a number of countries with large populations in Asia that are predominantly Muslim, and they have very strict censorship regimes where morals issues, and especially gender and sex issues, are concerned. Malaysia, Indonesia, these are very, very populous countries, and Hollywood has done very well in them in the past. But when you start including content that's a little more liberal, then those censors are going to clamp down, and you're going to lose a lot of money. So, it winds up being an equation of the more money that we spend on a film, the less we want to touch on hot topics.
Hmm. Yeah, I had a German friend over 2 or 3 weeks ago visiting, and uh, it was really frigid outside. So we spent some time played tennis outdoors a little bit, but the other points he wanted to just kind of hang out and watch movies. So we pulled up El Dorado, John Wayne, Robert Mitchum, and then I pulled up I think it's The Big Sleep, uh, Robert Mitchum, or is it Farewell My Lovely, perhaps, with Charlotte Rampling. It was one of those two Raymond Chandler movies, and they were great. We had a great time, and it gave me a little bit of, to quote another movie title, nostalgia. It gave me some nostalgia for movies. And um, are those are am I just being a kind of a old sentimental fool for yearning for movies with interesting dialogue, quick repartee, some moral sensibility that's not that's probably more in line with the kind of classics? Um, you tell me, does Hollywood make those? And does any of this play out in some of the geopolitics that of the different moods and sensibilities of these other countries? Can we go back to a place where our movies were more acceptable worldwide? Should we care?
Does Hollywood make those kinds of movies today? Not really. Could it make them again? Yes. Should it make them again? Absolutely. Will it do so? That's the bigger question. And this is a huge. I mean, we could spend a couple hours just on this alone. But what part of what's going on is there's a cultural disconnect between the people who occupy the high echelons of media, and that goes all the way from news to publishing to Hollywood to radio and on and on. There's a disconnect between that strata and the workaday people who live between the coasts and
Mm-hmm.
who work 9 to 5 and don't do glamorous work, and maybe they're insurance salesmen, and maybe they're office workers,
Mm-hmm.
hospital workers, truckers, who knows what they are, but their tastes and their sensibilities are not those of the people who are increasingly farmed for the leadership and the high creative roles in Hollywood. Now, the reason the movies that you're talking about, what happened back then, you didn't have to graduate from a film school to direct a movie in the 1930s. You had people who came from all other walks of life. They came out of vaudeville. They came. They fell into the movie business. Maybe they walked onto a set one day and somebody said, "Hey, kid, you want a job?" That happened. My father was part of that, and my father came to Hollywood with a little bit of limited experience in theater and literature, and he opened an acting school and did very, very well. Worked at Warner Brothers and didn't have to sort of break in the way that a lot of people have to break in now with connections. There's so much money and there's so much at risk. So when there's so much at risk, that now creates a structure where, how do you get in? Well, you get in because you went to the right university and you have the right connections, and so knew somebody, and now you're into a network that is completely divorced. It's the network that lives on the coasts, and this is our great cultural divide. We have a nation of two coasts and then everything in between. And what Hollywood needs is to, and I've been encouraging this for years, it needs to invest in making film a career option for people elsewhere in the world. A kid growing up in a township in Uganda should have access to the tools of filmmaking to find out if this is something that he wants as a career or she wants as a career. I did some filmmaking workshops with Syrian refugees in Jordan a few years ago,
Mm-hmm.
and they're extraordinarily talented. Just putting that opportunity in front of these young men, and especially these young women, was so illuminating, because once they realized what they could do with it to tell their stories, once they realized that this was an option available to them, it stirs something. And there's talent all over this country. There's talent in Kansas. There's talent in Nebraska. There's talent in Idaho and talent in South Carolina. And they shouldn't have to go to elite film schools in LA and New York and work the room and make connections and schmooze in order to have a Hollywood career, in order to even make
Mm-hmm.
movies. There should be pathways all over the country for all people from all walks of life, so that you do get a pool of the very best talent.
Fair enough. There's also, the half and half, um, which is not just a dairy creamer, but uh, the half the country that seems to get ignored politically. I mean, the last time I've seen these elections, it's pretty close. Goes one way, goes another, and yet the movies seem to, if not outright alienate, aside from the rare film, ignore or downplay or deprecate half the potential audience. I mean, is this I guess it's a persistent business model. It's probably been successful. Um, Again, it was not always that way, I don't think.
Mhm.
Does that persist? And then the kind of additional inside question would be, is there a Joe Rogan um, approach to movies? Are movies turning into potential siloed kind of thing aspect we see in the political sphere, where people just say, you know what, this is not going to get published in the Washington Post, it's not going to get published in NBC. I'm going to do it myself, and I'm going to either get my Substack or this and that, and it's going to work its way up differently. And does that speak to the Syrian or whatever, some other small nationalities who might be able to just generate their own audience?
It does, and again, this is a huge subject, but I would put it this way. What we've seen over the last 20 years, and especially over the last 10, as it's accelerated with the internet touching every aspect of our lives, is what I call the democratization of everything, which is that all of these gatekeeping entities have been sidelined or reduced in impact. So you don't need a publisher to put your book out there. You don't need a retail space to sell your wares. You don't need a network to do a TV show. You don't need a record label to record your music and put it out there. You don't need a publisher for a book. All of these gatekeeping entities that used to sort of filter things to the top so that the broader public knew what was, ordained, that doesn't really exist anymore. It exists in a very reduced way. So the consequence is everybody can do everything all the time for everyone. But that also creates noise and too much content. So now we need new gatekeeping. And far from that democratization creating a broader culture, it has created these little mini cultures, these monocultures, where we do now self-silo. We only read the news sites that validate our perspective. We only seek out the movies that validate our taste. We go and we create. We have now become our own individual gatekeepers, and that atomizes everything, I think, in a very destructive way. In 1970, half the country tuned in every Sunday night to watch Bonanza. That will never happen again. But that happened because there was nothing else to watch. It was the gatekeeping.
Well, they might watch Yellowstone, but it's not going to be the entire country.
Exactly. It's not going to hit those same numbers. So what we need to do is to get back to a place where someone is making something that at least a third of the country wants to all do together.
Mm-hmm.
And that might sound like pie in the sky, but I don't think it is. I think
Well, it actually sounds like the NFL.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Sports is the last frontier for all of that. Yeah.
So I just kind of touching back on the Blair Witch Project for a second. It just occurred to me, I probably about 2 years too late, that somebody could have, should have, would have done the Blair Witch Project in reverse, in a sense, the same basic format, but you go out there and everyone lives. There's this horrible monster out there, but when you get out and you get out of your, you take your mask off, you get out of the house, and I don't know, you hug and kiss your girlfriend or something like that, you don't die, you don't drop dead, and you get COVID, you're in bed with the sniffles, and then you're immune forever. I'm not sure that there would have been an audience for that. It might have gotten
There's an audience
stigmatized.
for everything.
Yeah, well, I think it was a tough kind of police. There was a lot of policing of what people could and couldn't do, even physically. I mean, in Australia, they had people run off the beach. I mean, even here, they had people run off the beaches for lying down, sunbathing, or kite surfing, or whatever it is.
Yeah, I mean, I am optimistic about where things will be eventually, but I do think that we're in for at least another year of hardship and transition,
Mm-hmm.
and the biggest hurdle in getting back to some degree of normality is it's in the minds of film goers. That's the one, is when they feel like ready to go back to the movies, when they say, you know what, I just spent 20 minutes going through screen after screen on Netflix and there's nothing that interests me. I really want to go out into public and sit in a dark room with strangers and watch a movie that I can't pause, that I can't fast forward
Hmm.
and just let myself be taken over by the experience.
Right.
There's something rare about that. And when people start to miss that enough, then we'll be back.
Yeah, fair enough. So where does that leave on a personal basis? Where does that leave a movie reviewer? What's how is your own personal industry been affected?
It affects me on two levels. I mean, I'm a filmmaker as well. So my wife and I have a production company. We've got our own projects, which we want to move ahead, and have obviously been been handicapped as much as anybody else. You move, some things move slowly, and other things don't move at all. So you're waiting for all of those stars to align if you're making projects, and reviewing them. It has been really interesting. I do radio, and we used to do radio in studio. We've only been back in studio now since about last month. We spent more than 2.5 years having to do it remotely, and it's still a skeleton crew at the studio. But when we went remote, we were no longer reviewing movies that only went to theaters, because there were no theaters. So now we were told, well, we got to review everything that shows up on Hulu, that shows up on Netflix, that shows up on Tubi, that shows up anywhere on a streaming platform or on VOD. And suddenly the rundown of films, on radio, you try to cover as many movies in a given week as you can. And
Hmm.
it used to be where there would be about 18, 20 theatrical releases in Los Angeles. And, maybe 4 or 5 of them are big wide releases, and the rest are little independent films. And you get through maybe 10. It is now where there are about 40 films a week streaming every possible platform. Most are horrible, made for next to no money, totally marginal, will never see their money back. And there's very little there that really warrants a theatrical release, much less even a major streaming release. So we have seen a real an increase in volume, but a decrease in quality product that has any kind of longevity, that will enjoy any kind of serious cultural footprint.
Hmm.
It's mostly vanity stuff. It's extreme low budget stuff, a lot of low budget horror. And this is not enough to sustain a multi-billion-dollar industry. We need those big movies. We need those mainstream movies. We need those movies like in the classic days of Hollywood, which appealed to all audiences across a broad base. We don't need siloed special interest product.
So um, I I'm a fan of Ricky Gervais, and his Golden Globe speech from a few years ago was
Agreed.
prior to COVID. Um, so let's say we could do what we do in what you guys do in Hollywood of just splicing. We cut out COVID-19, COVID-20, COVID-21, COVID-22, and we just put the movie back to his speech and the ramifications, repercussions, which I assume in Hollywood were nil, aside from not inviting him back. Um, what would Hollywood have been without this caesura, this kind of break?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I think it would obviously be in a healthier place economically. Definitely wouldn't, the bottom lines of these companies would be in a better place. But I think a lot of the other problems would remain, and on some level, and time will confirm whether I'm right or not in forecasting this. On some level, I think COVID focused us on problems which we might otherwise not have seen. It helped sort of expose a lot of shortcomings and vulnerabilities and weaknesses, and uh, whether or not we are able to work on those, we will see. I'm hopeful about the future of the Academy Awards. I think the Academy Awards have seen a decade of just sheer disaster. They've lost 75% of their audience in less than 10 years, and really in about 5 or 6 years, and really lost the reputation has plummeted. But there's new leadership at the Academy. They're making a lot of long-term moves. It was recently announced that they plan on exercising an option in their contract and possibly leaving ABC in 2028.
Hmm.
That's really kind of remarkable news. So I think there are these corners. I'm hopeful with the new ownership and leadership at Warner Brothers Discovery, despite all of
And,
yeah.
and Disney as well.
Iger coming back to Disney, that's another big move. We'll see how that pans out. Some people are very happy about that. I'm guardedly optimistic. I think Iger should probably be a stepping stone to somebody else.
Right.
Um, uh, these are all reasons to be hopeful. Whether it actually turns out that way, we will see. I mean, look, I'll put this out there right here. If I were the board of Disney, I would consider bringing Dick Cook back to that company to be CEO. Those who don't know, Dick Cook, started as a tram driver at Disneyland, worked his way up to one of the highest executives there. Now he's an independent producer now, but Robert Iger really would prefer to retire. Bring Dick Cook back. He's a guy who has Disney in his veins. That would really, really instill confidence, not just in the company's leadership, but in a restoration of the brand. So if those kinds of changes follow on these current changes, if what we're seeing now is an intermediary to something positive down the line, then I think we're in good shape for 10 years from now.
Fair enough. So we're rounding up the hour. Just a few minutes left. I have one tiny question, which is about Los Angeles and California. Whether some of the political aspects still regarding COVID exist, whether they are, whether they have any self-interest politically, financially, in kind of bringing the industry back, and then whatever closing statements you want to have in the next couple minutes.
The idea that Hollywood is a politically monolithic place is perception. It is somewhat rooted in truth, but my experience is it's not entirely that way. I think people think of Hollywood as like this sort of hard left wing monolith. I think those voices are the loudest voices here, and they're the voices that control the boardrooms and the suites, and that have the ear of the boardrooms and the suites. But I think if you break it down, I think you find that about a third of Hollywood is, I'd say you'd find about a fourth of Hollywood is very, very left wing. About a fourth of Hollywood is kind of moderately liberal. About a fourth is conservative, but will not admit it. And another fourth really doesn't care one way or the other. They just want to work, so they will say or do whatever they need to not, rock the boat and keep their jobs. And that's kind of how I see it, give or take. Those are the proportions. Now, right now, obviously, there's the loudest, the squeaky wheel is the one that gets the grease and controls the product. But that's not where the public is. That's not where most audiences are. And I think over time, when you get pushback like Disney got in Florida, and as the studios are getting elsewhere in the world, you eventually will have to seek content creators who are more conducive to making the kinds of content that the rest of the world wants to see, or the rest of the country wants to see. I think eventually you have to respond to your market. You can't just be governed by by the creative.
I think so. My own theory within your theory is that what I call the Dave Chappelle theory. It's kind of that has to be somebody from within those groups that they can't touch, based on some of their own little kind of strange sorting methods, and they can't insult them right off the bat. So if you have some guy from Iran who's a good director and has had some, say more conservative concepts, which I don't wish on the public in general per se, but not the worst of Iran, but some of the kind of more family oriented conservative aspects, which I think is pretty much standard across the globe, you might see some traction.
Yeah, I agree. No, I agree.
All right. So last word, in our last 30 seconds.
Last word, I would say, just as a bit of encouragement to people who are frustrated with Hollywood, take matters into your own hands. There's no reason why, no matter who you are or where you live, that you can't make an impact as something other than an audience member. Write a script, or make some context. Try to be the change. Don't just wait for someone else to make the change.
All right. Well, thank you, Wade. You can stay on. We're going to head out, and I'm going to give my own shameless self-promotion here. This is my book, Overturning Zika. It's got my name on the bottom. It's got a huge mosquito. This is a great story. It's a really great story. The disappearance of Zika microcephaly. If you don't remember, it was Brazil 2015, 16, and then it disappeared. There's a story there, and it's a really interesting story. It's a little bit like Twister, the movie, where they're hunting tornadoes, but in fact, they wound up hunting something that doesn't probably really exist. Anyway, so that's for anybody interested in movies who want to follow up on that. Get a hold of me. Thank you so much, Wade. I'm hopeful that we can maybe see you again sometime soon.